Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, into what, from the outside, looked like an ordinary American family. His father, Lionel Dahmer, was a chemist, a man dedicated to science and academia. His mother, Joyce Flint, struggled with her own battles, depression, anxiety, and a volatile temperament that often left the household tense and unstable. From the very beginning, Jeffrey's world was marked by dysfunction. Though he was the first child, the center of his parents' attention, the marriage was already cracking beneath the surface. Frequent arguments and emotional distance created a home filled not with warmth, but with instability. As a young boy, Dahmer appeared quiet, even shy. Teachers described him as polite, if somewhat withdrawn. He wasn't the type of child to cause disruption in class, but neither was he the kind to stand out. He faded into the background, an ordinary face in a classroom of children. Yet, behind the facade of normalcy, something darker was already taking root. By the age of 4, Dahmer had undergone a painful surgery to correct a double hernia. For a child so young, the operation was traumatizing, and it left him with a deep sense of vulnerability and insecurity. In his early years, Jeffrey showed signs of curiosity that veered far from the interests of most children. Where others collected baseball cards or played with toy cars, Jeffrey's fascination centered on dead animals. When he found roadkill near his home, he would study the remains, dissecting and examining them with an unusual precision. His father, a scientist, initially thought this was nothing more than a budding interest in biology. Lionel even showed his son how to preserve bones in jars of chemicals, never suspecting how this simple scientific lesson would one day merge with Jeffrey's darkest impulses. But Dahmer was not simply curious, he was fixated. He would ride his bike through the neighborhood searching for dead creatures, and when none were found, he created his own opportunities. He decapitated animals, preserved their skulls, and arranged bones as though building a private museum. This wasn't play. It was ritual, a strange compulsion that gave him comfort, a sense of control in a chaotic world. While Jeffrey was developing these disturbing habits, his family life continued to fracture. His mother's erratic behavior, fueled by mental health struggles and prescription medication, clashed with his father's frequent absence due to work. Arguments between his parents escalated, leaving Jeffrey increasingly isolated. When his younger brother, David, was born in 1966, the attention Jeffrey once received vanished, deepening his sense of neglect. He became more withdrawn, quiet to the point of invisibility, often spending hours alone, wandering the woods or lost in thought. By the time Dahmer entered high school, he had transformed from a quiet child into a deeply alienated teenager. He struggled to fit in, not because of overt bullying, but because he simply could not connect. His classmates later recalled his odd sense of humor, what became known as doing a Dahmer. He would mimic epileptic seizures or mock people with disabilities. Antics that earned him temporary laughter, but also cemented his reputation as an outsider. He was both ridiculed and tolerated, a strange figure in the school halls who seemed to belong nowhere. Alcohol soon became his coping mechanism. By the age of 14, Jeffrey was drinking heavily, even sneaking alcohol into class. His teachers noticed his slurred speech and detached demeanor, but no real intervention took place. Dahmer's alcoholism wasn't merely teenage experimentation. It was a way to numb the emptiness and silence the urges he didn't yet understand. Those urges, however, were becoming more defined. As puberty arrived, Dahmer began to recognize his homosexuality, a reality that, in the conservative atmosphere of the 1970s Midwest, only added to his sense of isolation. he could not reconcile who he was with the world around him. But more troubling than his sexuality was the direction his fantasies began to take. He dreamed not of mutual relationships, but of domination, control, and possession. In his mind, desire became entangled with violence, and attraction merged with the stillness of death. By his later teenage years, these fantasies had escalated. He imagined himself with unconscious partners, people who could not leave, could not resist. The seeds of his future crimes were already planted. Even if no one around him could see it, he was the quiet boy in the back of the class, the one who never made waves. But inside, his world was one of shadows. In 1978, the year of his high school graduation, Dahmer's life reached a critical turning point. His parents' marriage finally collapsed. The divorce left the family scattered. His mother took his younger brother and left, while his father moved out as well. At just 18 years old, Dahmer was left completely alone in the family home, abandoned in a house filled with silence. For a boy who had always felt invisible, the solitude was overwhelming. And in that emptiness, his fantasies turned to action. That summer, on a quiet road in Bath Township, Ohio, Jeffrey Dahmer committed his first murder. He picked up 18th year old hitchhiker Stephen Hicks, offering him a ride with the promise of beer and companionship. What began as casual conversation in Dahmer's isolated home quickly shifted as his need for control consumed him. When Hicks tried to leave, Dahmer struck him with a dumbbell, crushing his skull, and then strangled him to death. In the aftermath, Dahmer dismembered the body, crushing the bones with a sledgehammer and scattering the remains in the woods behind his house. The crime was not planned with sophistication, nor covered up with precision. It was raw impulse, a terrifying release of the fantasies that had been building inside him for years. Yet despite the brutality, Dahmer's crime went unnoticed. The quiet teenager, now a high school graduate with no direction, had crossed the line from fantasy into murder. This was the beginning of a darkness that would only deepen. The child, once fascinated by bones and carcasses, had taken his first human life. From this point forward, Jeffrey Dahmer was no longer simply a troubled youth. He was on the path to becoming one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. The summer of 1978 marked the true beginning of Jeffrey Dahmer's descent into the abyss. At just 18 years old, he had crossed an irreversible line with the murder of Stephen Hicks. For most people, such an act would leave a trail of panic, guilt, or some sign that something terrible had taken place. But for Dahmer, the murder was met not with immediate terror, but with a chilling mix of relief and fascination. He had finally acted upon the fantasies that had consumed him for years, and in the act of killing, he discovered something that both horrified and exhilarated him, the sensation of total control. Yet outwardly, Jeffrey Dahmer still appeared to be nothing more than a lost young man struggling to find his place. He graduated from Revere High School in June of 1978 with little distinction. His classmates remembered him as a heavy drinker, a loner, and someone who seemed to wander aimlessly through life. Few imagined that only weeks after graduation, he had already taken a life. At home, Dahmer's world was unraveling. His father had moved out after the divorce, and his mother had taken his younger brother away, leaving Jeffrey alone in the family house. It was during this period of complete isolation that he killed Hicks and dismembered his body. Incredibly, his crime left no trace, no suspicion from neighbors, and no missing person case that would connect back to him. For the time being, Jeffrey Dahmer had gotten away with murder. After the killing, however, Dahmer did not immediately embark on a killing spree. Instead, his life spiraled in a different direction. aimless and struggling to cope with his urges, he turned even more heavily to alcohol. By the fall of 1978, Lionel Dahmer returned home to find his son spiraling into a pit of drunkenness and depression. Worried about Jeffrey's lack of direction, Lionel pressured him to enroll in college. That fall, Jeffrey entered Ohio State University, hoping to study business. But his time there was short-lived and disastrous. His alcoholism consumed him. He skipped classes, failed exams, and spent much of his time intoxicated. Within just 3 months, Jeffrey dropped out. The boy who had once seemed shy but intelligent was now adrift, failing at even the most basic attempts at building a future. In an effort to salvage his son's life, Lionel pushed Jeffrey into the U.S. Army. In January 1979, Dahmer enlisted, training as a combat medic in San Antonio, Texas, before being stationed in West Germany. On the surface, the military gave Jeffrey structure and purpose. His training was rigorous, his duties clear. But the same demons that plagued him at home followed him across the ocean. During his time in the Army, Dahmer's drinking habits worsened. His inability to control his addiction soon impacted his performance. Fellow soldiers noticed his behavior. He was often drunk, unreliable, and socially isolated, more disturbingly. Later reports and testimonies from former soldiers revealed that Dahmer had also sexually assaulted at least 2 of his comrades during his military service. These accounts suggest that his desires for domination and control over unwilling victims did not remain dormant during his years in uniform. By March 1981, after just over 2 years of service, Dahmer was deemed unfit for duty and was honorably discharged. The Army, perhaps eager to wash its hands of a problem soldier, chose not to disclose the reasons for his discharge to future employers or authorities. Instead, Jeffrey Dahmer was simply sent home, released into civilian life without supervision or rehabilitation. When he returned to the United States, Dahmer was a man without direction. His father suggested he move in with relatives in Florida, hoping a change of scenery might help. Jeffrey relocated to Miami Beach, taking a job at a sandwich shop and renting a small room in a motel. But once again, alcohol consumed him. He spent his paychecks on liquor, often drinking himself into oblivion. Unable to maintain stability, he was eventually evicted from the motel and forced to live on the streets. By late 1981, he had no choice but to return to Ohio and live with his father and stepmother. They tried to impose rules, hoping to straighten him out. But Jeffrey's erratic drinking and lack of responsibility made the arrangement impossible. Eventually, Lionel sent him to live with his grandmother in West Allis, a suburb of Milwaukee. This decision, though made with the best of intentions, would prove to be a turning point. In his grandmother's house, Jeffrey Dahmer found a place of privacy, a place where his dark fantasies could begin to resurface. It was here, in his grandmother's basement, that Jeffrey began to collect pornography, particularly material focused on men. He frequented gay bars and bathhouses in Milwaukee, exploring his sexuality in secret. Yet, what should have been an opportunity for connection and identity instead became entangled with his violent urges. Dahmer's fantasies were never about companionship or love. They were about control, possession, and the silencing of resistance. His grandmother, a devout woman, grew uneasy with his behavior. She noticed his drinking, his late nights, and his increasingly secretive habits. At times, she found disturbing items, strange smells from the basement, knives, or even a man's mannequin he had stolen from a store and hidden in his room. She scolded him, prayed for him, and urged him to change. But Jeffrey's descent was already in motion. The years between 1978 and 1981 were critical in shaping Dahmer's double life. On the surface, he was the troubled son and grandson, a man struggling with addiction and failure, drifting between family homes and dead-end jobs. But beneath that thin mask was the emerging predator. He had already tasted the thrill of murder, and though several years had passed since the death of Stephen Hicks, the urge had not disappeared. It had simply been suppressed, waiting for the right moment to reemerge. As the 1980s progressed, Jeffrey Dahmer's life would continue to spiral. His time in the military, his failed attempt at independence in Florida, and his move into his grandmother's home in Wisconsin all converged to create the conditions for what was to come. The boy who once dissected animals and the teenager who committed a solitary murder was about to evolve into something far more dangerous. Jeffrey Dahmer was no longer just a troubled young man struggling with addiction and loneliness. He was a predator in waiting, one who had learned how to hide in plain sight. The years of failed opportunities and buried secrets were building toward an explosion of violence. And soon, the quiet streets of Milwaukee would become the backdrop for a series of horrors that the world would never forget. By the early 1980s, Jeffrey Dahmer's life seemed to have settled into a strange and deceptive rhythm. After drifting between failed attempts at independence, bouts of homelessness, and heavy drinking, he found himself living once again under the roof of his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin. To outsiders, this arrangement appeared harmless. A troubled young man staying with his kind, elderly grandmother while trying to get back on his feet. But in reality, her home became the first stage of Dahmer's dark transformation into a predator whose compulsions could no longer be contained. At first, Dahmer's life there was uneventful. He helped with chores, attended church with his grandmother, and occasionally found work to appease his family. But beneath the surface, his private world was growing increasingly disturbing. He spent hours alone in the basement, drinking excessively and surrounding himself with stolen objects that reflected his obsessions. One of the first signs of escalation came in the form of a mannequin he stole from a store. For Dahmer, the mannequin was not a novelty, but a substitute for companionship. A silent partner that could not reject him, could not leave, and existed entirely under his control. His grandmother, disturbed by this behavior, forced him to get rid of it, but the act revealed just how deeply his fantasies had taken hold. By the mid-1980s, Dahmer began to explore Milwaukee's gay bars and bathhouses. He sought out encounters, but his desires were never rooted in intimacy. Instead, they were bound to the idea of complete submission. Soon, he began drugging men with sleeping pills, rendering them unconscious during their encounters. These incidents became so frequent that Dahmer was eventually banned from several bathhouses. Still, no criminal charges followed. His predatory behavior remained hidden, shielded by the secrecy of the gay community at the time and the unwillingness of authorities to intervene. In 1986, Dahmer was arrested for indecent exposure after being caught masturbating near two boys. A year later, he was charged again, this time for enticing a minor. He lured a young boy into his home, an incident that could have exposed his darker tendencies far earlier. He was sentenced to probation, counseling, and mandatory registration as a sex offender. Yet despite these legal troubles, Dahmer managed to slip through the cracks, presenting himself as a troubled but harmless man in need of help, rather than a predator in the making. During this same period, Dahmer secured a job at the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory in Milwaukee, working the night shift. The work provided him with financial stability, but it also allowed him the freedom to pursue his secret life undetected. While his grandmother believed he was simply working long hours, Dahmer was using his income and time to indulge his compulsions. It was in 1987, nearly 9 years after the murder of Stephen Hicks, that Dahmer finally killed again. His victim was Stephen Twomey, a 25-year-old man he met at a bar. Dahmer persuaded Twomey to return with him to a hotel room. According to Dahmer's later confession, he claimed to have no memory of the killing itself, only of waking up to find Twomey's lifeless body beside him. What followed was a gruesome act of concealment. Dahmer purchased a large suitcase, stuffed Twomey's body inside, and transported it back to his grandmother's basement. There, over several days, he dismembered the body, disposing of flesh and organs while keeping the bones. For Dahmer, this murder was both horrifying and exhilarating. It awakened in him the realization that killing had given him something he could not find anywhere else: absolute possession of another human being. From that moment forward, the pace of his killings began to escalate. He lured young men, often gay men of color, into his web with promises of money, alcohol, or companionship. Once inside his grandmother's house, Dahmer drugged them, strangled them, and experimented with their remains. His obsession with bones, first seen in childhood, returned with full force. He bleached and preserved skulls, attempting to create a private collection, a shrine to his dominance. His grandmother, though deeply religious and attentive, began to notice strange occurrences. Odd smells emanated from the basement. She confronted Jeffrey about them, and he explained them away as spoiled meat or chemical accidents from his taxidermy experiments. She occasionally found knives, mannequins, or even men's clothing that didn't belong to him. Though she suspected something was terribly wrong, she never uncovered the full truth. In 1988, Dahmer's killings nearly came to light. He lured a 13-year-old boy into his grandmother's house, intent on drugging and assaulting him. But the boy escaped and told authorities. Dahmer was arrested and charged with second-degree sexual assault and enticing a child. This should have been the moment when his reign of terror ended. Yet once again, the justice system failed. He was sentenced to a year in prison, but with work release privileges, allowing him to continue his job at the chocolate factory. Even worse, he served only 10 months before being released on probation. Dahmer's release in 1989 marked the beginning of his most prolific period. During this time, he had already developed a routine, a ritual, and a method of killing that would soon spiral into a frenzy of violence. His double life was firmly established. By day, he was the quiet factory worker, the polite grandson who attended family gatherings and faded into the background. But by night, he was something entirely different. A predator who stalked bars, bus stops, and clubs, searching for men he could lure into his trap. His grandmother's house, once a place of refuge, had become a secret slaughterhouse. The killings of the mid-1980s marked the transition of Jeffrey Dahmer from a disturbed young man dabbling in criminal behavior to a fully active serial killer. He had refined his methods, learned how to manipulate both his victims and the system, and begun to embrace the rituals of dismemberment and preservation that would define his crimes. What made Dahmer so chilling was not just the brutality of his acts, but the calm, ordinary life he maintained on the surface. Neighbors, co-workers, and even family members saw him as awkward but harmless. No one suspected that behind his quiet demeanor, he was hiding skulls, bones, and body parts, carefully arranged and preserved as trophies of his secret world. By the time the 1980s came to a close, Jeffrey Dahmer was no longer simply an alcoholic drifter with troubling tendencies. He was a serial killer in full control of his methods, one who had tasted murder and found it impossible to stop. His apartment in Milwaukee, which he would soon move into after leaving his grandmother's house, was destined to become a place of unspeakable horror, a place where his darkest fantasies would finally run unchecked. The escalation had begun, and the world would soon come to know the name Jeffrey Dahmer not as a troubled man, but as a monster whose crimes would shock the conscience of an entire nation. In May of 1990, Jeffrey Dahmer moved into the Oxford Apartments at 924 North 25th Street in Milwaukee. Unit 213 would become the epicenter of his depravity, a small, one-bedroom apartment that on the surface seemed unremarkable, but within its walls, Dahmer would commit crimes so grotesque that they would shock the world for decades to come. It was here that his killing spree reached its peak, and his secret life fully evolved into a nightmare of murder, mutilation, and cannibalism. By this time, Dahmer had already killed several men while living with his grandmother, but her growing suspicions and constant presence had limited his freedom. The move into his own apartment gave him something he had craved for years: complete privacy. No questions about strange smells. No one walking unexpectedly into the basement. No interruptions. In this new space, he was free to indulge every dark fantasy without fear of discovery. Almost immediately after settling into the Oxford Apartments, Dahmer's killings resumed. His method had become disturbingly efficient. He would lure men, often young, vulnerable men of color, into his apartment with promises of money, drinks, or photographs. Once inside, he would drug them with sleeping pills, rendering them unconscious. From there, he strangled them, dismembered their bodies, and, in many cases, preserved parts of them as trophies. Dahmer's fascination with preservation had grown far beyond the simple bone collecting of his youth. He experimented with different techniques to keep skulls, skeletons, and even organs intact. He wanted more than souvenirs. He wanted possession. Victims were not just people to him. They were objects of control, reduced to body parts he could arrange, store, and revisit at will. But the darkness of Dahmer's crimes did not stop at murder and dismemberment. His fantasies had now extended to cannibalism. He admitted later that he ate parts of his victims, hearts, thighs, muscles, as a way of feeling closer to them, of making them a permanent part of himself. It was not hunger that drove him, but obsession, a perverse ritual that blurred the line between intimacy and annihilation. The neighbors at the Oxford Apartments occasionally grew suspicious. Residents complained about foul odors seeping from Dahmer's unit. He explained them away with excuses: spoiled meat, a broken refrigerator, or tropical fish that had died in his tank. At times, he even offered food or friendly conversation, masking his horrors with awkward politeness. The building was home to many low-income tenants, and police attention to complaints was minimal. Dahmer thrived in that neglect, hiding in plain sight as his crimes escalated. Inside apartment 213, the atmosphere was one of chilling contradiction. On the outside, it appeared ordinary: a couch, a small television, a fish tank, a refrigerator. But behind closet doors, inside drawers, and beneath the bed lay a macabre collection. Skulls bleached and painted, skeletons assembled like grim decorations, and photographs documenting the stages of dismemberment. His freezer held human remains wrapped in plastic. In his bedroom closet, he kept severed heads carefully preserved. This was no longer just a killer's den. It was a shrine, a museum of death curated by a man who saw his victims not as human beings, but as possessions. Between 1990 and 1991, Dahmer killed at an alarming pace. His victims included Raymond Smith, Edward Smith, Ernest Miller, David Thomas, Curtis Strotter, Errol Lindsay, Tony Hughes, Conarak Synthesophone, Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, and Joseph Breithoft. Each man had a life, a story. and dreams of their own, but in Dahmer's world, they were reduced to objects of desire, tools for his compulsions, and ultimately, trophies for his collection. Dahmer's cruelty extended beyond murder. He conducted experiments on some of his victims, attempting to create what he described as zombies. He drilled holes into their skulls while they were still alive, pouring in acid or boiling water in an effort to render them unconscious but alive. Compliant partners who would never leave him. These attempts were gruesome failures, leaving his victims in agony before their inevitable deaths. Yet, in Dahmer's twisted logic, the experiments were an attempt at solving what he saw as his greatest problem, the inability to make his partners stay. Perhaps the most haunting example of his cruelty came with 14-year-old Konorak Synthesomphone. The younger brother of a boy Dahmer had already assaulted years earlier. In May 1991, Dahmer lured Konorak into his apartment, drugged him, and attempted one of his zombie experiments. Somehow, Konorak escaped, stumbling into the street, naked, disoriented, and bleeding. Neighbors quickly called police, who arrived on the scene. They found the terrified boy with Dahmer, who calmly explained that Konorak was his 19-year-old lover, drunk after an argument. Shockingly, the officers accepted Dahmer's explanation, escorting the boy back into the apartment despite protests from concerned witnesses. Within minutes of their departure, Dahmer killed Konorak and continued his rituals. That moment, an intervention that could have ended his spree, stands as one of the most devastating failures in law enforcement history. Despite multiple close calls, Dahmer's confidence grew. He was working at the chocolate factory by day and killing at night. He drank heavily, but his routines gave him cover. Even when neighbors continued to complain of smells and strange noises, police largely ignored the warnings. It seemed as though nothing could pierce the facade he had constructed. By July 1991, however, his carefully built world of secrecy was beginning to collapse. His apartment was filled with body parts, skulls, and evidence so overwhelming that discovery was inevitable. Yet Dahmer continued almost compulsively, as if unable to stop himself even when he knew exposure was near. He later confessed that by this time, he was killing not out of thrill, but because the urge had become a need. The compulsion had overtaken him completely. The Oxford apartments were by then a building of whispered fears and unanswered complaints. Residents knew something was wrong in apartment 213, but few could imagine the scale of horror that lay within. Inside, Dahmer was surrounded by the remnants of his victims, skulls, skeletons, and photographs. Living in a world he had created, a grotesque reflection of his darkest fantasies. By the summer of 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer had killed 17 men. His apartment had become a chamber of horrors, unlike anything investigators had ever seen. And though he believed his secrets were safe, the end of his reign was closer than he realized. By July of 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer's life had become a dangerous balancing act between his ordinary outward existence and the monstrous reality hidden inside his apartment. Apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments was by then overflowing with evidence of his crimes. Skulls lined drawers. Photographs documented the stages of dismemberment, and human remains filled the freezer. Neighbors still complained of the odors and strange sounds, but Dahmer always had an excuse. The building had become a place of dread, yet no one could have imagined the full scale of what was happening behind his locked door. The end of his killing spree began on the night of July 22, 1991. On that evening, Dahmer encountered 3 men, Tracy Edwards and 2 friends, near downtown Milwaukee. With his usual charm, awkward but persuasive, Dahmer invited them back to his apartment. He promised money in exchange for posing for photographs. 2 of the men declined, but 32-year-old Tracy Edwards reluctantly agreed to go with him. From the moment Edwards stepped into apartment 213, he felt uneasy. The smell was overwhelming, a rancid mix of chemicals and decay. There were strange boxes, jugs of acid, and a faint stench that clung to the air. The apartment was dimly lit, with windows covered and a fish tank glowing in the background. Edwards later described the atmosphere as chilling, a place where something felt terribly wrong. Dahmer tried to maintain his calm demeanor, offering drinks laced with sedatives. Edwards, however, became increasingly suspicious and declined to drink. As the minutes passed, Dahmer's mask began to slip. He suddenly grabbed Edwards and attempted to handcuff him, securing one cuff around his wrist. When Edwards resisted, Dahmer pulled a knife and threatened him. In that moment, Edwards realized the danger he was in. He was trapped in the apartment of a man who clearly intended to harm him. For hours, Edwards used his wits to stay alive. He talked calmly, tried to humanize himself, and convinced Dahmer to sit with him on the couch. He listened as Dahmer spoke about his fantasies, about wanting to control someone completely. Edwards played along, pretending not to resist, waiting for any opportunity to escape. Eventually, Edwards saw his chance. He asked if they could move into the living room to watch television. As they sat together, Edwards noticed Dahmer's attention drift. Summoning all his courage, he suddenly punched Dahmer in the face, broke free, and ran out the door with the handcuff still dangling from his wrist. He sprinted into the street, flagging down 2 Milwaukee police officers. The officers listened as Edwards frantically explained what had happened, pointing them toward Dahmer's apartment. At first, it seemed like yet another routine call, a domestic dispute, perhaps an attempted assault. But when they followed Edwards back to apartment 213, what they discovered defied comprehension. Jeffrey Dahmer greeted them calmly, even attempting to explain away the situation. He claimed it was a misunderstanding, that Edwards was simply overreacting. But the officers noticed the smell, the strangeness of the room, and the knife Edwards had described. They decided to search the apartment. What they found would horrify them for the rest of their lives. In Dahmer's bedroom, one officer opened a drawer. Inside were dozens of Polaroid photographs, images of young men, alive in some, dismembered in others. The photographs documented each step of Dahmer's ritual, the drugging, the strangulation, the dismemberment, and the preservation of body parts. These were not random pictures. They were trophies, each one carefully posed and cataloged. The officer turned to his partner, holding up the images. "These are for real?" he said. At that moment, Jeffrey Dahmer realized it was over. He attempted to resist arrest, but the officers subdued him. They called for backup, and soon the apartment was swarming with police. What began as a routine response had turned into the discovery of one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history. As investigators searched apartment 213, the true scale of Dahmer's atrocities emerged. They found skulls in the refrigerator, a human heart in the freezer, bones, jars containing preserved organs, and photographs of victims posed like grotesque works of art. In total, they recovered the remains of 11 men inside the apartment. Acid-filled vats held dissolving torsos. Boxes contained skulls carefully cleaned and arranged. It was a chamber of horrors unlike anything they had ever encountered. For the residents of the Oxford apartments, the news was devastating. They had lived next door to a serial killer, their complaints of foul odors and strange behavior dismissed as trivial. Now, they learned the truth, that behind the thin walls of apartment 213, men had been murdered, mutilated, and consumed. As word spread, the public reacted with shock and disbelief. Jeffrey Dahmer The quiet chocolate factory worker, the awkward man who lived alone, had been hiding a world of horror in plain sight. The reality was too grotesque to comprehend. Cannibalism, necrophilia, experiments on living victims. This was not just a serial killer. This was a man who had descended into a darkness so profound that it defied imagination. In the hours following his arrest, Dahmer was taken into custody. He remained disturbingly calm, as though relieved that the cycle of killing was finally over. For years, he had lived with the burden of his compulsions, the endless need to kill, and the constant fear of discovery. Now, in police custody, he confessed readily, sparing no detail of his crimes. The capture of Jeffrey Dahmer marked the end of a 13-year killing spree that claimed 17 lives. It also marked the beginning of one of the most disturbing investigations in American history. The photographs, the remains, the confessions, all painted a picture of a man who had gone beyond the boundaries of ordinary evil, into a realm of horror that society struggled to understand. For the families of the victims, the discovery was both devastating and validating. Their sons, brothers, and friends had vanished without explanation, their disappearances dismissed or ignored. Now the truth emerged, a truth more horrifying than anyone had imagined. On July 22, 1991, thanks to the bravery of Tracy Edwards, Jeffrey Dahmer's reign of terror finally ended. The man known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, who had hidden in plain sight for years, was unmasked, and the world would never again look at him as just a quiet, awkward neighbor. From that day forward, Jeffrey Dahmer would be remembered as one of the most infamous serial killers in modern history. After his arrest on July 22, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer was transported to the Milwaukee Police Department. The man who had been subdued in his own apartment, surrounded by the evidence of his crimes, sat in custody with a strange sense of calm. Unlike many killers who attempt to deny, deflect, or escape responsibility, Dahmer quickly began to talk. It was as if the weight of his secrets, carried in silence for over a decade, had finally grown unbearable. Now exposed, he seemed almost relieved. From the very first interviews, detectives were stunned by his willingness to confess. He spoke with chilling clarity, recounting his crimes in a monotone voice, as though describing ordinary events. There was no hysteria, no attempts to justify or excuse. He simply told the truth, his truth, layer by layer, revealing a life of murder, mutilation, and ritual. As investigators questioned him, the sheer scope of his killings became clear. Dahmer admitted to murdering 17 young men between 1978 and 1991. He described how he lured them, often at bars, bus stops, or on the street, offering money, alcohol, or companionship. Once inside his apartment, he would drug them with sleeping pills, strangle them, and then dismember their bodies. His calm explanations left detectives horrified. One of the most chilling aspects of Dahmer's confession was the detail with which he described his rituals. He admitted to keeping skulls and bones as trophies, bleaching them, and arranging them in his apartment. He spoke of photographing his victims at various stages, alive, unconscious, and dead, as a way of capturing and preserving them. To Dahmer, these acts were not random but purposeful. He wanted to create a collection, a shrine of sorts, that embodied his ultimate fantasy: complete possession of his victims even after death. But perhaps most disturbing was his admission of cannibalism. Dahmer calmly explained how he had cooked and eaten portions of his victims, hearts, thighs, and biceps. He said it made him feel as though his victims became a permanent part of him, that consuming them gave him a connection no one could take away. For detectives, this revelation was almost too much to process. Cannibalism was not merely shocking. It was evidence of a psychological descent into a darkness few could comprehend. Equally horrifying were Dahmer's experiments on the living. He described how he attempted to create what he called zombies. By drilling holes into his victims' skulls and pouring in acid or boiling water, he hoped to destroy parts of their brains while keeping them alive but docile. His goal was to create partners who would never resist or abandon him. These grotesque experiments failed, leaving his victims in unbearable agony before they died. Yet Dahmer spoke of them without visible remorse, presenting them as failed attempts to solve his obsession with control. Investigators listened in shock as he recounted the case of Konarak Synthesymphone, the 14-year-old boy who had escaped his apartment only to be returned by police. Dahmer admitted how he convinced officers that Konarak was his adult lover, and how he killed the boy shortly after the police left. The ease with which he described this failure of intervention highlighted not only his cunning, but also the devastating missed opportunity that could have saved lives. Despite the gruesome details, what struck detectives most was Dahmer's demeanor. He was cooperative, polite, even courteous. He did not appear insane in the traditional sense. He was not ranting, delusional, or incoherent. Instead, he was calculating, logical, and disturbingly self-aware. He acknowledged the horror of his actions, but insisted he could not control the urges that drove him. In his words, it was as though a compulsion, a need, had overtaken him. As his confessions unfolded, investigators meticulously documented every detail. They matched his statements to the evidence found in his apartment. Photographs, preserved body parts, tools, and written notes. Everything he said aligned with the grisly discoveries. There was no doubt. The monster hiding behind the quiet exterior had finally revealed himself completely. Psychologists and forensic experts were brought in to analyze Dahmer's behavior. They debated whether he was legally insane, driven by uncontrollable impulses, or whether he was a cold, calculating killer fully aware of his actions. Dahmer himself offered chilling insight. He admitted that he knew what he was doing was wrong. He said he fought against his urges at times, trying to stop himself, but always failed. In one interview, he remarked, it became an obsession. It was a never-ending cycle. His father, Lionel Dahmer, later joined him for some of these interviews. Confronted with the enormity of his son's crimes, Lionel struggled with disbelief and guilt. He recalled Jeffrey's childhood fascination with bones and animals, wondering if he had missed the signs. Jeffrey, in turn, told his father that he never blamed him, that his compulsion was something deeper, something he himself did not understand. The community of Milwaukee reeled as the details emerged. Families of victims faced the unimaginable truth of how their loved ones had died. Activists criticized police for failing to act on earlier warnings, especially in cases involving victims of color and members of the gay community. The sense of horror was matched only by anger at how many opportunities to stop Dahmer had been missed. For detectives, the case was unlike anything they had ever experienced. The crime scene at apartment 213 had been overwhelming, but hearing Dahmer calmly describe what he had done brought a different kind of horror. He was not a faceless monster. He was a man sitting across from them, speaking in a measured tone, explaining acts so vile they defied human comprehension. In the weeks that followed, Dahmer continued to cooperate, providing maps, drawings, and detailed accounts that helped investigators identify his victims. He remembered their names, their appearances, even the specific ways he had killed them. For families, these details were both devastating and necessary, bringing closure to years of uncertainty. By the end of the interrogations, one fact was undeniable. Jeffrey Dahmer was one of the most prolific and sadistic serial killers in American history. His crimes combined murder, necrophilia, cannibalism, and experimentation in ways that placed him in a category beyond comprehension. Yet what made him most terrifying was not just the brutality of his acts, but the ordinariness of his appearance. He was not a shadowy figure lurking in the night. He was a quiet man who worked at a chocolate factory, a neighbor who exchanged polite greetings, a face that blended into the crowd. The monster, it turned out, was hiding in plain sight. The interrogations revealed everything. Every murder, every ritual, every secret. For Jeffrey Dahmer, there was nothing left to hide, and for the world, there was nothing left but horror at what had finally been uncovered. By early 1992, the world knew Jeffrey Dahmer not as the quiet neighbor from apartment 213, but as one of the most infamous serial killers in history. His confessions, delivered with chilling honesty, had revealed horrors few could imagine. The remains, the photographs, the admissions of cannibalism and necrophilia, all of it painted a picture of a man who had lived for years in the grip of unimaginable darkness. But now came the question of justice. How would society deal with Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer? His trial began in January 1992 at the Milwaukee County Courthouse under the intense glare of global media. Cameras surrounded the building. Journalists filled the seats, and the families of victims prepared to confront the man who had stolen their sons, brothers, and loved ones. For them, the trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was a search for closure in the face of unbearable pain. The charges were staggering. Dahmer faced 15 counts of murder in Wisconsin, with another charge pending in Ohio for his first known victim, Stephen Hicks. Each count represented a life lost, a family shattered, and a crime that defied human decency. If convicted on all counts, Dahmer faced life imprisonment many times over. From the very beginning, there was no question of guilt. Dahmer had confessed in detail, and the physical evidence was overwhelming. His defense team did not attempt to deny what he had done. Instead, they pursued one of the most controversial defenses in criminal law's insanity. The question at the heart of the trial was not whether Jeffrey Dahmer had killed. He clearly had. The question was whether he was sane when he committed those murders. The prosecution argued that Dahmer knew exactly what he was doing, that he meticulously planned his crimes, concealed them, and attempted to avoid capture. He may have been disturbed, they said, but he was not legally insane. The defense, however, painted a different picture. They argued that Dahmer's compulsions, his necrophilia, and his attempts to create zombies showed a man consumed by madness. They described him as driven by uncontrollable urges, unable to understand the morality of his actions. They claimed he was sick, not evil, and should be placed in a mental institution rather than a prison. To the public, the distinction felt almost meaningless. The details of Dahmer's crimes were so grotesque that many believed insanity was the only possible explanation. Yet the law required a precise definition. Insanity meant being unable to distinguish right from wrong at the time of the crimes. Dahmer himself complicated matters further. In interviews and confessions, he acknowledged that he knew his actions were wrong, but he claimed he could not resist the compulsion to kill. The trial unfolded with expert witnesses on both sides. Psychiatrists testified for the defense, describing Dahmer's paraphilias, his compulsions, and his inability to control his desires. They explained how his need for control and possession over his victims went beyond rational thought. On the other side, prosecution experts argued that Dahmer's ability to lure victims, to dispose of bodies, and to deceive police showed clear awareness and intent. His careful concealment of evidence, they said, was proof that he knew his actions were criminal. Perhaps the most dramatic moments of the trial came from the victims' families. One by one, they faced Dahmer in court, giving impact statements that were raw, emotional, and unforgettable. They spoke of the sons they had lost, of the pain of not knowing what happened for years, and of the unimaginable horror of learning the truth. Their voices shook, their anger boiled over, and their grief filled the courtroom with unbearable weight. Through it all, Jeffrey Dahmer sat quietly. He rarely showed emotion, listening with bowed head as the families poured out their rage and sorrow. Some described him as expressionless, others as remorseful. To many, his silence only deepened the mystery of who he truly was, a monster, a madman, or something in between. On February 15, 1992, after weeks of testimony and argument, the jury delivered its verdict. They rejected the insanity defense. Jeffrey Dahmer was found legally sane at the time of his crimes and guilty on all 15 counts of murder. Judge Lawrence Graham Jr. addressed Dahmer directly during sentencing. His words were stark. "It is my duty to inform you, Jeffrey Dahmer, that your punishment is that you will spend the rest of your life in prison." He imposed 15 consecutive life sentences, ensuring that Dahmer would never walk free again. Later in Ohio, Dahmer received another life sentence for the murder of Stephen Hicks. In total, his punishment amounted to 16 life terms. For the families of the victims, the verdict was both a relief and a torment. Relief that Dahmer would never again harm anyone, that justice had been served in the legal sense. Torment because no sentence, however long, could bring back the lives lost. Some felt the death penalty would have been more fitting, but Wisconsin had abolished capital punishment more than a century earlier. Life in prison was the maximum the law allowed. Dahmer himself accepted the verdict without protest. He expressed remorse, telling the court and later interviewers that he wished he could die, that he deserved the punishment he received. He spoke of his crimes as if they were driven by a compulsion he could never understand, and in the end, he told reporters he was relieved to be stopped. The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer became a defining moment in American legal history, not only because of the horrific nature of the crimes, but also because of the debate it sparked about mental illness, criminal responsibility, and the boundaries of justice. Was Dahmer insane, or was he simply evil? Could someone who committed such monstrous acts still be considered rational under the law? The jury's verdict answered those questions in legal terms, but in the public imagination, the debate continues to this day. For Milwaukee, the trial marked the closing of a terrible chapter. The Oxford apartments were eventually demolished, as no one could bear to live in the shadow of apartment 213. The city struggled with its reputation, forever associated with one of the most infamous killers of modern times. For the families, life would never be the same. Their grief remained long after the cameras left the courtroom. In the end, Jeffrey Dahmer was not sent to a hospital but to prison, a place where he would live among other criminals, under the watch of guards, stripped of the freedom he had abused so horrifically. His life, once consumed by secrecy and compulsion, was now confined to a cell, where the only company he would keep was the echo of his own crimes. When Jeffrey Dahmer entered the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, in 1992, he left behind a world that had been consumed with shock, grief, and outrage. His trial had ended with 16 life sentences, ensuring that he would never again walk free. Yet for many, the question lingered, how would a man who committed such monstrous crimes adapt to life behind bars? From the very beginning, prison officials recognized Dahmer's notoriety. He was not just another inmate. He was the Milwaukee Cannibal, the man whose name was etched into headlines around the world. Authorities feared for his safety, knowing that other prisoners might target him out of vengeance, disgust, or even fame. For this reason, Dahmer spent his early months in isolation, separated from the general prison population. Alone in his cell, he had little contact with others, and this confinement allowed time for introspection. During these months, Dahmer appeared subdued. He cooperated with guards, kept to himself, and followed rules. Unlike many inmates, he did not lash out or cause trouble. Instead, he seemed to accept his fate. In interviews, he expressed remorse not only for what he had done, but also for the pain inflicted on families and the community. "I should have been put to death for what I did," he once admitted. His words carried a tone of resignation, as though his existence now was simply a waiting game. But Dahmer's time in prison also brought unexpected developments. In 1994, he sought religious guidance. After speaking with a prison minister and corresponding with his father about matters of faith, Dahmer decided to be baptized into the Christian faith. The ritual was conducted in the prison's chapel by a local pastor, and for Dahmer, it seemed to represent an attempt at spiritual cleansing. Some believed his conversion was genuine, an act of repentance from a man who had been consumed by evil and now sought forgiveness. Others were skeptical, seeing it as an empty gesture, a way to ease his conscience in the face of eternal damnation. Regardless of motive, Dahmer spoke openly about his belief in God after his baptism, telling interviewers that he had finally found a sense of peace, however small, within prison walls. Yet peace was hard to come by in an environment like Columbia Correctional Institution. While Dahmer may have found spiritual relief, the other inmates had not forgotten who he was or what he had done. Among the prison population, he was despised. His crimes, particularly the cannibalism and necrophilia, placed him at the very bottom of the inmate hierarchy. To many prisoners, he was worse than a murderer. He was a man who had desecrated bodies, a man whose actions violated every sense of human decency. Reports from inside the prison revealed that Dahmer developed a dark, provocative sense of humor. At times, he would shape his prison food into mock body parts, drizzle ketchup to mimic blood, and pretend to consume it in front of other inmates. Whether this was his way of coping with the notoriety or a means of taunting others remains unclear, but it only fueled resentment. For those who already viewed him as a monster, his macabre jokes confirmed their hatred. Still, Dahmer maintained a quiet routine. He read the Bible, exchanged letters with his father, and occasionally gave interviews where he reflected on his crimes. In these interviews, he rarely sought to excuse himself. Instead, he often admitted that what he had done was unforgivable. He described his compulsions as an addiction, a need for control that spiraled beyond anything he could contain. Now, behind bars, he said he was glad to be stopped, glad that the cycle of killing was over, even if it meant living the rest of his life in a cell. But the prison walls could not shield him forever. By late 1994, Dahmer was moved out of isolation and allowed more interaction with the general population. Officials believed the risk had lessened, but tensions remained. Many inmates still carried deep resentment toward him. Some wanted to hurt him, not just for his crimes, but also for the way he carried himself in prison. Life in Columbia was harsh, and Dahmer, unlike many hardened criminals, was not physically imposing. Though tall, he was quiet, passive, and vulnerable in a place where strength often meant survival. For months, rumors circulated about potential threats against him. Guards knew it was only a matter of time before someone acted on the hatred that simmered inside the prison. Meanwhile, Dahmer's family continued to grapple with his legacy. His father, Lionel Dahmer, visited him, searching for answers about how his son had become what he was. In public interviews, Lionel spoke of his struggle, of seeing Jeffrey as both his son and as the monster the world knew him to be. He wrote a memoir, hoping to come to terms with the devastation Jeffrey had caused, yet also grappling with his own feelings of guilt and responsibility. For Jeffrey himself, the remaining years in prison became a strange mixture of routine, reflection, and looming danger. He attended church services, prayed, and seemed to accept his punishment. But prison is not a place where infamy fades. Inmates whispered his name, guards kept watch, and the tension surrounding him never disappeared. By 1994, the signs were clear. Dahmer's survival in prison was tenuous. He may have embraced faith. He may have accepted his punishment. But to those around him, he was still the cannibal. Still the man whose crimes had shocked the world. And in the violent ecosystem of prison life, that kind of reputation carried a deadly price. What Jeffrey Dahmer may not have realized was that his time was running out. His crimes had ensured his place in history, but within the walls of Columbia Correctional Institution, they had also marked him for vengeance. Life in prison was never going to be a life of peace. For a man who had inflicted terror and death on so many, his own fate would soon arrive, brutal, sudden, and final. By the autumn of 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer had been living behind the walls of Columbia Correctional Institution for a little over 2 years. During that time, he had adjusted to the routines of prison life, found religion through baptism, and spent long stretches reflecting on his past crimes. Yet beneath the surface, resentment toward him never faded. For the other inmates, Dahmer was not just another prisoner. He was a symbol of evil, a man who had taken lives in ways so grotesque they defied comprehension. His presence in the general population was a constant source of tension. Guards knew that his notoriety put him in danger. Dahmer was infamous, his face recognized around the world. Within the prison, he carried an aura of dark celebrity. Some inmates despised him for his crimes, others for the way he sometimes mocked his reputation. Reports circulated of Dahmer shaping food into body parts, smearing ketchup on them, and pretending to eat them in front of others. Whether he meant it as a joke or as a twisted form of acceptance, such behavior only deepened the hatred many felt toward him. Among those who took particular notice of Dahmer was Christopher Scarver, a fellow inmate serving a life sentence for murder. Scarver was a troubled man with a history of mental illness, claiming at times that he heard voices and believed himself to be on a divine mission. To Scarver, Jeffrey Dahmer was the embodiment of evil, someone whose crimes demanded punishment beyond what the court had delivered. On the morning of November 28, 1994, Dahmer's fate was sealed. He was assigned to a routine work detail in the prison gymnasium, along with another inmate, Jesse Anderson, a man convicted of murdering his wife. Dahmer was escorted to clean bathrooms and showers under the supervision of correctional officers. It was supposed to be an ordinary task, a way for prisoners to earn privileges through labor. But the guards, for reasons never fully explained, left the 3 men unsupervised for a short period of time. What happened next was swift and brutal. Christopher Scarver, carrying a metal bar that he had taken from the prison's weight room, attacked both Dahmer and Anderson. The weapon was heavy, capable of inflicting devastating injuries. In those few moments, Scarver unleashed his rage, striking Dahmer repeatedly in the head and face. The blows were so violent that Dahmer collapsed to the floor, bleeding and unconscious. By the time guards returned, the scene was one of horror. Dahmer lay motionless, his head crushed by the force of the attack. Jesse Anderson, too, had been beaten severely and would later die from his injuries. Dahmer, still alive but critically injured, was rushed to a nearby hospital. Doctors tried to save him, but his wounds were too extensive. At 9:11 a.m., Jeffrey Dahmer was pronounced dead. He was 34 years old. News of his death spread rapidly, first through the prison, then across the nation, and finally around the world. The man who had confessed to killing 17 young men in one of the most horrifying serial murder cases in history was himself murdered behind bars. For many, it felt like a grim kind of justice, a final reckoning that no court could deliver. For others, it was a troubling reminder of the violence that thrives within prison walls. Reactions to Dahmer's death were divided. Some families of the victims expressed relief, believing that he had finally paid the ultimate price for the lives he had taken. Others felt robbed of the chance to see him live out his punishment day after day in the isolation of a cell. To them, death was too quick, too merciful for the suffering he had caused. Christopher Scarver later spoke about the killing, explaining that he believed he had been chosen by God to deliver justice. He said Dahmer's mocking behavior, his jokes about cannibalism, had enraged both him and other inmates. Scarver claimed that the voices he heard convinced him to act, that eliminating Dahmer was part of a divine mission. Whether motivated by religious delusion, personal hatred, or a mixture of both, Scarver's actions ensured that Dahmer's story ended not with decades in prison, but with a violent death at the hands of another murderer. Inside Columbia Correctional Institution, questions arose immediately. Why had the guards left Dahmer, Anderson, and Scarver alone? Was it negligence, or was it deliberate, an unspoken allowance for vengeance to be carried out? Official investigations concluded that it was a lapse in supervision, but many remain convinced that some prison staff turned a blind eye, knowing full well that Dahmer's notoriety made him a target. Dahmer's death also ignited renewed debate about the nature of justice. Was it justice that he had been murdered by another inmate, or was it another act of senseless violence, no different from the killings that landed men like Scarver behind bars in the first place? For society, the answers were complicated. Some viewed Dahmer's murder as fitting, a reflection of the brutality he had inflicted on others. Others argued that allowing inmates to kill one another undermined the very notion of law and order. In the days after his death, Dahmer's body became another subject of controversy. His brain was preserved for study, as scientists and psychologists sought to find answers about what had driven him to kill. Was there something physically wrong with his brain, a biological explanation for his compulsions? His parents, Lionel and Joyce Dahmer, fought over the issue, his father believing his brain should be studied, his mother arguing that it should be laid to rest. After legal disputes, his brain was ultimately cremated along with the rest of his body. The Oxford apartments, where his crimes had been uncovered, had already been demolished in 1992, leaving only an empty lot where so many lives had been lost. Now, with Dahmer's death, the final chapter of his story closed. But for the families of his victims, the wounds remained open. His death did not erase the pain, nor did it restore the lives he had taken. Jeffrey Dahmer's murder inside Columbia Correctional Institution was as violent as the life he had lived. A man who had killed without mercy, who had desecrated bodies and consumed human flesh, met his end in a bloody confrontation on a prison floor. It was not the calculated ritual he had imposed on his victims, but it was sudden, brutal, and final. In the end, Jeffrey Dahmer was denied the long years of reflection and punishment that life imprisonment might have forced upon him. Instead, he died violently at the hands of another murderer, his life extinguished in the same cycle of brutality he had once inflicted on others. And so, the Milwaukee Cannibal's reign of terror, one that had horrified the world, ended not in quiet repentance, but in a pool of blood on the cold floor of a prison bathroom. The death of Jeffrey Dahmer in 1994 did not mark the end of his story. If anything, it cemented his place in history as one of the most infamous serial killers of all time. His crimes, trial, and murder in prison left behind questions that still haunt society. Long after his body was cremated, the name Jeffrey Dahmer continued to echo across headlines, books, documentaries, and conversations. His legacy was not one of remembrance for who he was, but for what he had done. A legacy of horror, obsession, and the darkest corners of human behavior. In the years after his arrest and death, the fascination with Dahmer grew. Writers, journalists, criminologists, and filmmakers examined every detail of his life, searching for answers. How could a quiet, awkward man transform into a killer who murdered and dismembered 17 young men? Was it nature, nurture, or something beyond human comprehension? His story became a case study in psychology, criminology, and the failures of law enforcement and social systems. For many, the first lesson of Dahmer's case was one of missed opportunities. Time and again, chances to stop him slipped away. Police ignored the complaints of neighbors about the smells coming from his apartment. Officers returned 14-year-old Conorak synthesophone to Dahmer's custody, despite the boy's visible injuries and pleas for help. Dahmer himself had brushes with the law, arrests for indecent exposure, molestation, and disorderly conduct that hinted at deeper problems. Yet no one connected the dots until it was far too late. His story revealed flaws in the justice system, biases against marginalized victims, and the dangers of dismissing warning signs. Another part of Dahmer's legacy is the pain carried by the families of his victims. For them, the fascination with his story often feels like a reopening of wounds. Their sons and brothers are sometimes overshadowed by the infamy of the man who killed them. The retelling of Dahmer's crimes, whether in documentaries or dramatizations, risks turning their tragedy into entertainment. Many families have spoken out, asking the world to remember the victims not as gruesome details in Dahmer's ritual, but as human beings who once laughed, dreamed, and lived full lives before he stole them away. Yet despite the calls for sensitivity, society's obsession with Dahmer endures. His crimes embody the extremes of human depravity, and people are drawn to trying to understand what seems incomprehensible. Books like The Shrine of Jeffrey Dahmer, films, and countless documentaries have attempted to explore his psyche. In recent years, dramatized series brought his story to new generations, reigniting debates about whether such portrayals honor truth or exploit pain. Psychologists and criminologists continue to debate Dahmer's mind. Was he a psychopath, devoid of empathy and conscience, fully aware of his evil yet unable to stop? Or was he a man consumed by mental illness, his compulsions spiraling into acts he could not control? Dahmer himself complicated these questions by admitting he knew his actions were wrong, even as he claimed he could not resist them. His case blurs the line between madness and evil, forcing society to confront uncomfortable truths about the human condition. Culturally, Dahmer became a symbol of hidden darkness. He was not an obvious monster. He did not live in isolation, nor did he appear outwardly threatening. He worked at a chocolate factory, shopped at local stores, and exchanged polite greetings with neighbors. He blended into the background of ordinary life. His story is a chilling reminder that some of the darkest individuals hide in plain sight, their true selves masked by banality. Dahmer's case also forced society to examine its prejudices. Many of his victims were men of color, immigrants, or members of the gay community. Their disappearances were often ignored, dismissed, or not pursued with urgency. The indifference of law enforcement toward marginalized victims allowed Dahmer to continue his killings unchecked. In this sense, his crimes exposed not only his own monstrosity, but also systemic failures rooted in bias and neglect. Even in death, Dahmer's presence lingers. The site of the Oxford apartments, where his crimes were uncovered, has never been rebuilt. It remains an empty lot, a silent memorial to the horror that once resided there. His father, Lionel Dahmer, lived with the shame of being the father of a serial killer, struggling publicly with questions of responsibility and guilt. His mother, Joyce, endured years of torment and illness, haunted by the knowledge of what her son had done. For them, Jeffrey was not merely the Milwaukee Cannibal. He was their child, and that contradiction created a private suffering few can comprehend. For the public, Dahmer's story continues to be a source of both fear and fascination. He is often grouped with names like Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and Charles Manson, figures who represent the darkest impulses of humanity. Yet Dahmer stands apart for the sheer brutality of his acts that crossed boundaries most killers never dared. Cannibalism, necrophilia. The attempt to create human zombies. These details ensure that his crimes are remembered not only as murder, but as something almost inhuman. And yet, in the end, Dahmer was very human. He was not a demon or a supernatural figure. He was a man born in 1960, raised in suburban America, shaped by family troubles, loneliness, and desire. His humanity is perhaps the most terrifying part of his legacy, because it forces us to admit that evil does not always wear a monstrous face. Sometimes it looks ordinary, speaks politely, and passes unnoticed until the truth is revealed. The lasting darkness of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes is not just in the details of how he killed, but in the questions he leaves behind. How many more opportunities were missed? How many other predators go unnoticed because society fails to listen to the vulnerable? What does it mean when someone so ordinary hides such extraordinary evil? For the victims' families, no answer will ever be enough. Their pain cannot be erased by understanding, nor can their loss be healed by punishment. The most important part of Dahmer's legacy is not his name, but theirs. The 17 young men he murdered deserve to be remembered, not as part of his story, but as individuals whose lives were cut short. Jeffrey Dahmer's reign of terror ended nearly 3 decades ago, but the echoes of his crimes remain. His name is etched into history, his actions a permanent stain on the human record. He will forever be remembered as the Milwaukee Cannibal, the quiet man who hid a nightmare inside his apartment. His legacy is a reminder of how fragile safety can be, how easily evil can hide in plain sight, and how deeply the scars of violence can cut into the fabric of a community. In the end, Dahmer's story is not just about death and horror. It is about vigilance, justice, and remembrance. His crimes force us to confront the darkest parts of human nature, but they also demand that we remember those who were lost. For while Jeffrey Dahmer's name may live in infamy, it is the victims whose memories should endure, shining against the darkness he left behind.